My name is Mia Calloway. I am 34 years old, and I want to tell you about the day my older sister stood at a podium in front of 200 people who loved me, held a microphone in her hand, smiled at me the way she had been smiling at me my entire life, and proceeded to dismantle everything I had spent 29 years building, not with cruelty that anyone could immediately recognize, but with the particular kind of precision that only someone who has studied you your whole life can deploy. Someone who knows exactly which words will land where, exactly which secrets will cause the most damage, exactly which version of you to present to a room full of people who are already emotional and already holding champagne glasses and already completely unprepared for what is actually happening at the front of the room. And I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story, which is that I saw none of it coming, not because I was naive, not because I was foolish, but because when you love someone, when you have loved them your entire life, when they are woven into every memory you have of childhood and holidays and the moments that made you who you are, you do not spend your time looking for the knife, you spend your time being grateful for the hand. Growing up in the Calloway house in Chicago meant growing up in Rachel's shadow, and I do not say that with bitterness because for most of my childhood I did not even recognize it as a shadow. I recognized it simply as the way things were, the way the sun rose on one side of the house and not the other, the way certain rooms got light in the morning and certain rooms did not. It was simply the architecture of our family. Rachel was the oldest. Rachel was the brightest. Rachel was the one who won the spelling bees and the debate competitions and the science fairs and came home with trophies that my parents displayed on a shelf in the living room that I passed every single day on my way to school. And I was Mia. I was the younger one. I was the quiet one. I was the one my mother described to strangers at church as the sweet one. And for years I held on to that word like it was enough, like being sweet was its own kind of prize, like the absence of trophies did not mean the absence of worth. And in many ways I genuinely believed that. I was not a child who spent her nights crying about what her sister had that she did not. I was a child who found her own quiet corners of the world and filled them with the things that made her happy, books and drawing and eventually the particular joy of watching children learn things for the first time, which is why I became a teacher, which is why standing in front of a classroom of 7-year-olds who are encountering a new idea always felt like the most important work in the world to me, because I understood in my bones what it meant to be seen and what it meant to be overlooked. And I had decided very early that no child in my classroom was ever going to feel the way I sometimes felt sitting at that dinner table while my parents asked Rachel about her grades and forgot to ask about mine. Daniel Mercer walked into my life on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I was 25 years old and he was 27, and he walked in through the front door of the school where I taught because his nephew was in my class and there had been a scheduling mix-up and he was the only one available to pick him up. And he stood in my classroom doorway in a gray jacket with rain on his shoulders and looked around at the drawings my students had made that were hanging from the ceiling on pieces of string, and he said, "This is the best room I have ever been in." And I laughed, and that was it. That was the whole beginning of everything. A gray jacket and rain and a man who looked at a room full of children's drawings and saw exactly what I saw when I looked at it, which was not decoration but proof. Proof that every child in that room had something inside them worth putting on paper, worth hanging up, worth displaying for the world to see. And Daniel understood that without me having to explain it, and in the 4 years that followed I learned that this was simply who he was. A man who looked at things carefully and saw what was actually there rather than what was convenient to see, which made what happened later so much harder to understand and so much longer to forgive. Rachel met Daniel at Christmas that first year, and I remember the moment clearly because I was watching her the way you watch someone you love when you want them to love the person you love, with that particular hopeful attention that is really just a form of asking, "Please see what I see, please understand why this person matters to me." And Rachel looked at Daniel across the dinner table and smiled, and Daniel smiled back. And my mother said something about how handsome he was, and my father shook his hand and asked about his work, and the evening felt like everything I had wanted it to feel like, warm and inclusive and easy. And it was not until weeks later that I started noticing the small things, the way Rachel texted Daniel directly rather than going through me, the way she found reasons to be wherever we were, the way her compliments about him always had a slight edge to them when we were alone. "You're so lucky he chose you, Mia. I always wonder what he sees in the quiet ones." And I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was what sisters did. I told myself that Rachel loved me and that whatever I was feeling was my own insecurity projecting itself onto her behavior. And I kept telling myself that for 4 years, right up until the moment she picked up the microphone. Daniel proposed on a Saturday morning in March, in the kitchen of our apartment. with coffee on the stove and the Chicago skyline outside the window, and a ring he had designed himself because he had been paying attention to the things I loved for 4 years, and he wanted the ring to look like something I would have drawn in one of my students' sketchbooks. And it did. It was simple and perfect and entirely itself. And I said yes before he finished the question, and we stood in our kitchen in our pajamas with the coffee starting to burn, and neither of us moved to turn it off because neither of us wanted to move at all. We just stood there holding on to each other in the particular way that people hold on to each other when they understand that something has just permanently changed and they want to stay inside the moment for as long as possible before the rest of the world finds out about it and it becomes a thing that belongs to everyone instead of just to them. And that morning was one of the happiest mornings of my life. And I want you to hold that image in your mind, because everything that comes after it will make more sense if you remember what it felt like to stand in that kitchen with the burned coffee and the Chicago skyline and the ring that looked like something out of a sketchbook and the absolute certainty that you were exactly where you are supposed to be. The wedding was planned for June, 14 months after the proposal, at a venue on the lakefront that I had fallen in love with the first time I saw it, because the light in the late afternoon came through the windows in a way that made everything look like it was inside a painting. And I spent those 14 months doing the things that people do when they are planning the happiest day of their lives. Choosing flowers and writing vows and tasting cake and spending hours on the phone with my mother going over guest lists. And through all of it, Rachel was present in the way that she had always been present in my life. Close enough to feel like support, angled in a way that I never quite examined directly. And when I asked her to be my maid of honor, she cried, real tears that rolled down her face while she held my hands in hers. And she said, "Of course, Mia, of course, there is nowhere else I would be." And I believed her completely because she was my sister and I had believed her my whole life, and I did not yet know that the speech she was already writing in her head was not the speech I thought it was going to be. The morning of my wedding, I woke up at 5:30 and lay in the darkness of the hotel room listening to my bridesmaids breathing in their sleep around me and feeling the particular kind of happiness that is so large it almost feels like fear. The happiness that lives right on the edge of something, that makes you want to hold very still because you are afraid that if you move too quickly it will shift into something else. And I lay there in the dark and thought about Daniel waiting in his own hotel room across the city, and I thought about my dress hanging on the back of the bathroom door, and I thought about the venue with the windows in the afternoon light, and I thought about every person who was going to be in that room watching us promise ourselves to each other. And somewhere in the middle of all those thoughts I thought about Rachel, who was asleep 3 feet away from me, who had helped me pick the flowers and had come with me to every cake tasting, and who had held my hand through every moment of wedding stress for 14 months. And I felt grateful, genuinely and completely grateful, which is the cruelest thing about what happened next. That the last feeling I had before it started was gratitude. The ceremony was everything I had imagined, and I will not let what came after take that from me. The way Daniel looked when I walked toward him, the way his face changed when he saw me, the vows we had written ourselves that made half the room cry, including my father, who had told everyone for months that he was not going to cry. The moment when it was done and we were standing there as the thing we had promised to be, and the room was full of the sound of people who were happy for us. And then the reception began and the dinner was served and the dancing started, and everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel until the moment Rachel stood up and picked up the microphone and tapped it once and the room went quiet, and she looked at me from across the room with that smile I had known my whole life, and I smiled back, because I thought she was about to give the most beautiful speech. I thought she was about to stand in front of everyone I loved and tell them who her sister was, and for about 45 seconds that is exactly what she did. She talked about our childhood, and she talked about the way I made her laugh, and she talked about the day I called her to tell her about Daniel and how happy I had sounded. And the room was warm and attentive, and I was looking at her with my heart completely open, and then something shifted, something small at first, a sentence that landed slightly wrong, a detail that was too specific. A story from my past that I had told her in private and never imagined hearing in a room full of 200 people, and I felt the first cold thread of something I did not want to name run through me. And then the next sentence came, and the next, and by the time I understood what was happening it was already too late to stop it. What Rachel did in that speech I am not going to repeat in full, because some of it belongs only to me and some of it belongs only to Daniel, and none of it belonged in that room. But I will tell you the shape of it, which was this. She took the private architecture of my life, the fears I had shared with her in vulnerable moments, the insecurities I had trusted her with, the things I had told her about my relationship with Daniel in the honest way that you talk to a sister, and she presented them to a room full of people in a way that was designed to look like affection while functioning as demolition. She framed my deepest fears as facts, she presented my private moments as patterns, She took the things I had said about Daniel in moments of doubt that every person in every relationship has, and she laid them out in front of him and 200 witnesses as though they were the truth of how I felt. And she did it with a smile on her face and tears in her eyes and the tone of someone who is simply being honest because she loves her sister too much to pretend. And the room did not know how to respond because it had happened so gradually that by the time people understood what they were hearing, it was already inside them, already doing its work. And Daniel was sitting beside me, and I could feel him going still in the way that people go still when something has landed in them that they have not yet decided what to do with. The reception ended the way things end when something is broken that everyone can feel but no one knows how to address. With a kind of forced continuation, people dancing and talking and pretending that the air in the room had not changed. And Daniel and I did not speak about it that night because there was too much of it and we were in public, and I think we both understood that whatever was going to happen next needed to happen somewhere private, and so we smiled and we danced and we thanked our guests and we drove to the hotel in a silence that was the loudest thing I had ever sat inside. And that night, lying in the dark in our honeymoon suite, I stared at the ceiling and listened to Daniel breathe beside me and understood for the first time in my life what it meant to be truly alone in the presence of another person, not because he had left, not because anything was over, but because something had been introduced into the space between us that had not been there before. A question that Rachel had planted there deliberately and carefully, and that was now growing in the dark whether either of us wanted it to or not. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Harder in some ways than anything that came before them, because they were the weeks in which I had to sit with the full weight of what had happened while simultaneously trying to build something on top of rubble. Daniel and I talked. We talked for hours and days and weeks, and he was not a man who believed everything he had heard. He was a man who asked questions and listened to answers and tried to find his way to the truth. But the truth is that even the most careful person cannot completely unring a bell, cannot completely unsee the thing that has been shown to them. And Rachel had known exactly what she was doing when she chose those particular details. She had known that the seeds she was planting were the kind that grow in the dark, in the quiet moments of doubt that every marriage contains. And even though Daniel stayed, even though we worked through it, even though we found our way back to each other over months of difficult and honest conversation, something had been taken from the beginning of our marriage that we could not get back. The ease of it, the lightness of it, the particular joy of a beginning that belongs only to the two people inside it, and I grieved that privately and completely for a long time before I allowed myself to be angry. My family's response taught me something I had been avoiding knowing for 30 years. Which was that the architecture of my childhood that I had always described as simply the way things were was not neutral at all. It was a choice, repeated daily, by people who had the option to choose differently. And when Rachel's behavior at my wedding became something that could not be ignored, when Daniel and I both reached out to my parents separately and explained what had happened and asked them to acknowledge it, what I received in return was not acknowledgement but management. My mother called me and said Rachel was going through something difficult and had not meant it the way it came across. My father said that weddings were emotional and that people said things they did not mean, and when I pressed them, when I asked them to look at what had actually been said and to tell me honestly whether they could see the intent behind it, the conversation shifted in the way it had always shifted my whole life, subtly, carefully, until somehow I was the one who needed to be more understanding. I was the one who needed to consider Rachel's feelings. I was the one who was making things difficult by refusing to simply move on. And I sat on the phone with my mother in the kitchen of the apartment that was now my married home, and I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been having the same conversation for their entire life and has only just understood that it was never going to end differently. I spent the next 5 years building something that had nothing to do with the family I had grown up in, and everything to do with the person I was choosing to become. Daniel and I found our way to each other fully, not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. The way things that are rebuilt after damage are sometimes stronger in the repaired places than they were before. And I poured myself into my work and my students and the small daily rituals of a life that was mine. And I kept my distance from Rachel without drama, without announcement, without the kind of formal cutting off that requires explanation. I simply stopped making myself available, stopped answering the calls that came less and less frequently anyway. Stopped showing up to the family gatherings where she would be present and everything would be performed and nothing would be real. And I want to be honest with you about something, which is that the distance did not feel like victory. It did not feel like strength. For a long time it felt like loss, because what I was losing was not the sister Rachel actually was, but the sister I had always believed she was going to become, the relationship I had spent 30 years believing we were building toward. And grieving a fiction is its own particular kind of pain because there is no one to blame for it except the part of yourself that kept believing. 5 years after my wedding, Rachel called me on a Thursday evening in November, and I saw her name on my phone and I sat with it for a moment before I answered. Not because I did not want to speak to her, but because I wanted to be completely present for whatever was about to happen. And when I picked up, her voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. Not the performance voice she used with our parents, not the bright competitive voice she used in rooms where she was trying to win something, but a smaller voice, a tired voice, the voice of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally put it down, not because they chose to, but because they could not carry it any further. And she told me that her relationship of 6 years had ended 3 months earlier, that the man she had been with had told her when he left that he could not spend his life with someone who was always trying to win, that her closest friends had one by one created distance from her over the past 2 years in ways she was only now beginning to understand, and that she had started seeing a therapist who had said something to her in their last session that she had not been able to stop thinking about, which was that the people who work the hardest to make others feel small are usually the people who feel the smallest themselves. And Rachel said to me, "I have been thinking about your wedding for 5 years, Mia. I have been thinking about what I did, and I have been telling myself stories about why I did it that made it easier to live with, and I need you to know that none of those stories were true, and I need you to know that I am sorry, not the kind of sorry that asks you to forgive me, but the kind that just needs you to know that I understand what I did, and I understand that it was wrong, and I understand that you did not deserve it." And I sat in my kitchen and listened to my sister's voice and felt something move in me that I did not expect to feel, not the old warmth, not the old longing for the sister I had always wanted her to be, but something quieter and more honest than either of those things, something that felt like the particular peace of finally being told the truth by someone you had stopped expecting it from. I did not forgive Rachel that night, and I want to be clear about that because I think there is a version of this story that people expect to end with forgiveness as the destination, as the proof that healing has happened. And I have come to believe that forgiveness is not a destination but a weather system, something that moves through you on its own schedule regardless of what you decide about the person who caused the harm. And what I told Rachel that night was not that I forgave her, but that I heard her, and that hearing her mattered, and that I was not interested in rebuilding what we had because what we had was not actually the thing I had believed it to be, but that I was open, carefully and with clear eyes, to the possibility of building something new, something honest, something that did not require either of us to perform a version of sisterhood that was never real. And Rachel said okay, and I said okay, and we stayed on the phone for a few more minutes talking about small things, her apartment, my students, the early Chicago winter that had come in hard that year. And when we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time in the quiet, and thought about the 34 years of my life that had brought me to that phone call, and I thought about Daniel asleep in the next room, and I thought about the classroom I was walking into the next morning, and I thought about the particular kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not require an audience, that is simply the accumulated weight of every day you chose to keep going when the easier thing would have been to let the people who underestimated you be right. And I thought, this is enough. This is more than enough. This is exactly the life I was supposed to build. Subscribe to She Said Enough because there are more stories like this one. Stories of women who were underestimated and overlooked and pushed to the edge, and who found their way back to themselves. And none of them are easy, and all of them are worth hearing.